Roman was still laughing when the notary opened the envelope. Not a polite, social lubricant kind of laugh, a real one, generous with itself, the kind that fills a conference room and pauses to look around, expecting company. He'd been laughing since the elevator, Vicky's hand tucked into the crook of his elbow like she belonged there, which, I supposed, she now did. She was 28 and gleaming and wore her hair in a low knot that probably took 40 minutes to make look effortless. She glanced at me once when we filed in, then looked away, the way you look away from something that makes you mildly uncomfortable about yourself. Arthur Hargrove's estate attorney, a woman named Eleanor Price, with silver hair cut to the jaw and the bearing of someone who had watched too many families come apart in conference rooms to be surprised by any of it, had called me 3 days earlier. "Your presence is requested," she'd said, in a tone that discouraged follow-up questions. I hadn't asked any. I knew Arthur was dead, a massive coronary, fast, 6 weeks ago, and I knew, or thought I knew, that I had no business at any reading of his will. The man had called me Roman's mistake to my face at a Christmas dinner 11 years ago. He'd watched me for 14 years with the particular coldness of someone who has decided in advance that you are not worth the trouble of genuine dislike. Roman found my invitation to the reading hilarious. He'd texted me the night before, "You're coming tomorrow?" Can't imagine what for. Maybe he left you his reading glasses. He was still riding that amusement when Eleanor Price opened the document and began to read. He stopped laughing approximately 40 seconds later. But to understand what happened in that conference room on a Tuesday in March, I have to go back. Not just 3 months to the divorce papers, and not just to the beginning of the marriage. I have to go back to a night when I was 29 years old, standing in Arthur Hargrove's kitchen at 11 p.m., helping his 63-year-old housekeeper clear the dishes from a dinner party he'd thrown for 12 of his business associates, because no one else had offered, and the woman's feet hurt. Arthur had come in for a glass of water. He'd looked at me across the kitchen for a long moment, those pale, measuring eyes, and then looked away without a word. I spent 14 years thinking that look was contempt. I was wrong about that. I was wrong about a great many things. I am a hospitalist physician. I work at Mercy General, which is a mid-sized hospital in a mid-sized city that is, in the way of mid-sized cities, neither quite prosperous nor quite struggling, just perpetually in the middle, managing. I have been doing this work for 15 years, and I am good at it in the specific way that hospitalists have to be good at it. I notice things. I read systems. When a patient presents with a cluster of symptoms that don't quite cohere, I don't look for the obvious diagnosis first. I look for the pattern underneath the pattern, the fracture the X-ray almost missed, the number in the blood panel that sits at the edge of normal and shouldn't. I did not apply this skill to my own marriage for 14 years. My name is Nina Mercer. I kept my maiden name professionally throughout the marriage, though I was legally Nina Hargrove on everything else: tax returns, the joint account, the deed to the house we bought on Sycamore Lane in 2010. I am 43 years old. I have dark hair that I wear to my shoulders, threaded with gray since my mid-30s that I've never bothered to color because I don't have patience for maintenance. I have what my friend Dee calls doctor hands, steady, deliberate, the kind that don't shake in a crisis, or if they do, no one notices because you've learned not to let it show. I have a small workshop in the back of my house where I restore antique furniture in my off hours, stripping layers of paint and varnish, replacing worn joints, recaning chair seats. It is the opposite of my day job in exactly the way I need it to be. Medicine is triage. Restoration is patience. I met Roman Hargrove when we were both 29. He was VP of Business Development at his father's construction holding company, and he was, At 29, the most effortlessly confident person I had ever been in a room with. Not arrogant. That came later, slowly, the way a photograph develops in a chemical bath. The image was always there, just waiting for the right conditions to make it visible. At 29, he was just certain, in a way I found deeply restful after years of being uncertain about almost everything. He had his father's pale eyes and his mother's easy smile. Roman's mother had died when he was 17, and Arthur had never remarried. And he laughed at my jokes, even when they weren't especially funny, which at 29 felt like intimacy. We married 14 months after we met. My parents came from Ohio for the wedding. Arthur Hargrove shook my father's hand without warmth and looked at me at the altar with an expression I would spend the next decade trying to decode. The marriage was fine. It was fine. That is the most honest word I have. For the first 6 years, it was better than fine. We had a life, a house, friends, routines. Roman traveled often for work. I worked long shifts. We had weekends in the fall when we raked leaves together, and he'd make chili from scratch, and I'd make him try wines he didn't want to try. We were good at the surface of things. We were practiced. Arthur Hargrove came for Sunday dinners twice a month and sat at our table with that same closed-off measurement in his eyes. And Roman always said the same thing on the drive home afterward. He warms up slow. He'll come around. 14 years of Sunday dinners. Arthur never came around, and Roman kept saying he would. I had 3 pregnancies. None of them made it past the first trimester. The first time, Roman held me while I cried. The second time, he was in Denver for a conference and sent flowers. The third time, I was alone at the clinic, and I called my friend Dee from the parking lot, and she was at my house with groceries before I'd even gotten inside. Roman was home when I arrived. He was on his laptop. He looked up and said, "How'd it go?" in the tone of someone asking about a dentist appointment. And I stood in the doorway of my own living room and felt something close and lock inside my chest, the way a door settles into a warped frame after years of swelling and shrinking. I did not tell Arthur about any of the pregnancies. It didn't occur to me that he'd want to know. It didn't occur to me then that Roman might have told him something else entirely. I also didn't mention to anyone, except Dee and my colleague Carla, the money I sent each month to St. Agatha's nursing home on the east side of the city, or about Mrs. Kowalski's surgery. Mrs. Kowalski was a patient I'd admitted twice in 3 months, 81 years old, no living family, a kidney tumor that was operable but that her Medicare plan wouldn't fully cover. I paid the surgical copay difference out of my own salary, $11,000. It was not a trivial amount. Dee knew, Carla knew because she'd been the nurse on that floor and had asked. My accountant knew because she'd needed the documentation. No one else knew. It was not the kind of thing I did for an audience. I also didn't know that someone else had found out. Roman told me he wanted a divorce on a Thursday afternoon in November, standing in our kitchen, and the precision with which he'd chosen his moment. I was home early, the house was empty, the conversation cleanly contained, struck me afterward as deliberate, not impulsive, planned. He said he'd been unhappy for a long time. He said we'd grown apart, which is what people say when they want to leave without explaining why, when the real explanation requires a confession they're not prepared to make. He was already with Vicky by then. I learned this later from Margot, who'd seen them at a restaurant in the 3rd week of October and called me immediately. I hadn't wanted to believe it. By November, I believed it. The divorce was swift and quiet. We had a prenuptial agreement that Arthur had insisted on before the wedding, which I'd signed without argument because it seemed reasonable and because I had my own money and my own career. and I was not marrying Roman Hargrove for his father's construction company. The agreement was clean. The house on Sycamore Lane had been purchased jointly. We sold it and split the equity. I took my retirement accounts and my workshop equipment and my books and my furniture pieces, and I moved into the Craftsman bungalow on Aldrich Street that I'd bought when property values dipped in 2019 and had been renting out since then. Roman moved into a downtown apartment that cost $4,000 a month and suited him. Vicky moved in 3 weeks after the divorce was finalized. I was 3 months out from the divorce when Arthur Hargrove died. I heard about it from Roman's cousin, who texted me out of courtesy because we'd always gotten along. I sent flowers to the funeral home and did not attend the service. I didn't think I was wanted. I grieved in the small, complicated way you grieve for someone who never let you close enough to properly love them, with a kind of wistful incompleteness, as if someone had handed you a book and then removed every other page. Then Eleanor Price called and told me to come to the reading. The conference room at Price & Associates was on the 14th floor, with windows that looked out over the city in a way Arthur probably would have approved of. You could see 2 of his buildings from there, the Hargrove Tower on 5th and the mixed-use development on the riverfront. Eleanor Price sat at the head of the table. To her left, Roman and Vicky, who had apparently assumed the invitation was optional for her and come anyway, and Roman's attorney, Bradley Vane, a lean man in a dark suit who had the energy of someone constantly checking which way the wind was blowing. To Price's right, me. On the table, a manila envelope and a sealed DVD case labeled in Arthur's handwriting with a date 3 months before his death. Eleanor read the will. Arthur Hargrove left his townhouse in the city to a cousin, his collection of first edition books to the public library, his vehicle to the company's facilities manager, who had driven him for 11 years and who, according to Arthur's handwritten note attached to the bequest, never once talked when I needed quiet. The operating shares of Hargrove Holdings were distributed as follows: 30% to Roman Hargrove, conditional; 40% to Dr. Nina Mercer; the remaining 30% held in trust for the company's general employees in perpetuity. Roman's condition: he would receive his 30% in full after 3 years, provided Nina accepted her seat on the board of directors and fulfilled her duties for that same period. If Nina declined or departed early, the combined 70% would transfer to the Hargrove Family Foundation for Palliative Care, an institution Arthur had funded quietly for years and that Roman had never taken seriously. The room was quiet for approximately 4 seconds. Then Roman laughed, a short, hard sound like a door slamming. "She doesn't know anything about construction," he said to no one in particular. "She is, however, a licensed physician with 15 years of experience reading complex systems and identifying what doesn't fit," Eleanor said, without looking up from the document. "Your father left a note." She produced a second sealed envelope, opened it, and read aloud. The note was 3 sentences. "Roman knows what he did. Nina doesn't yet. She will." The silence that followed this was different from the first. Vicky moved slightly in her chair, not toward Roman, but away, a degree or two, barely perceptible. Bradley Vane studied the table. I sat with my hands flat on the polished wood and felt something cold and specific move through my chest. Not shock exactly, something more like recognition. The sensation I get sometimes with a difficult patient. The feeling of seeing a chart for the first time and knowing, before I've processed a single number, that I am looking at something serious, something that has been going on for a long time, quietly, while everyone told themselves it was something simpler. Eleanor placed the DVD case in front of me. "There's a video," she said. "He asked that you watch it alone." I watched the video in Eleanor's private office with the door closed and her assistant stationed outside with instructions not to disturb. Arthur Hargrove sat in a leather armchair I recognized from his study. He was thinner than the last time I'd seen him, which had been, I realized with a cold jolt, almost 8 months ago, at a Sunday dinner that had ended early when Roman said I wasn't feeling well, though I had been perfectly fine. Arthur wore a dark suit and his reading glasses. Those glasses, tortoiseshell frames, slightly crooked on the left side, from where he'd sat on them once and never had them properly adjusted. I had noticed the crook years ago and thought about mentioning it. I never did. He looked at the camera for a moment before he spoke, in the way of someone unused to addressing something that cannot respond. Nina, I'll keep this brief. I don't have much patience for sentiment, and you've probably noticed that by now. He had both hands on the arms of the chair. His knuckles were prominent. 3 years ago, I hired a man named Walter Garner to look into your life. Not your finances, your life. How you spent your time when you weren't at the hospital. Where you went, what you did. I expected to find something useful, a weakness, a compromise. A pause. Walter found nothing of the kind. He shifted slightly in the chair. What he found was a woman who drove to St. Agatha's nursing home on Sunday afternoons and spent 2 hours with residents who had no family left, who paid for a surgical procedure for a patient out of her own salary and filed no paperwork about it, who had lost 3 pregnancies in silence and told no one who wasn't a close friend. He looked away from the camera, toward the window of his study, where the light was the pale, early winter kind. I lost my wife when Roman was 17. He was just starting at that school, the one he wanted, the expensive one, out of state. I couldn't bring myself to pull him out. I don't know if that was right. I have thought about it many times. He returned his gaze to the camera. I spent 14 years looking at you and seeing what Roman told me you were. An interloper. Someone who kept him from the family. Someone who complained about me when you thought I couldn't hear. Someone who found the Sunday dinners an obligation. Who had asked Roman more than once whether maintaining a relationship with his father was really necessary for their life. A pause. Walter found evidence that none of that was true. Walter also found evidence of other things that took me longer to understand. He folded his hands. I was a slow man, Nina. I am sorry for it. The annex, the old house on Halcott Street, where I grew up, is yours outright. No conditions attached. I registered it in your name 2 years ago. What you find there is yours. I would have told you this in person, but by the time I understood what I needed to tell you, some doors were already closed. He took his glasses off, looked at them, set them on the side table beside the armchair. The glasses are in the annex. I left them there on the window ledge in the old study. I always meant to have the left arm fixed. I never got around to asking. The video ended. I sat in Eleanor's office chair for a long time. The window was behind me. The city was quiet outside, going about its Tuesday afternoon business. I became aware that my hands were shaking. Not badly, the small, sustained tremor you'd miss if you weren't looking for it. And I pressed them flat against my thighs and breathed through it the way I breathe through difficult clinical conversations, the ones where you have to tell a family something they are not ready to hear, but that the numbers have made unavoidable. 3 pregnancies. He had known. He had known about all 3, and Roman had told him what? What story had Roman given his father about 3 losses I had survived in near silence? And why had Arthur,
when he finally looked for himself and found something different, found it necessary to protect me with a deed already registered, a will already rewritten, a video sitting in Eleanor Price's files. I left Eleanor's office and walked past the conference room where Roman and Bradley Vane were still at the table, with raised voices and a sheaf of papers between them.
I took the elevator down 14 floors and walked to my car in the parking structure and sat in the driver's seat with both hands on the wheel and the city's gray afternoon pressing against the windshield. What did Roman tell him about me? And then, quieter, like a second pulse, what else didn't I know? The girls already had coffee waiting when I got to Margot's SUV the following Saturday morning. It was 7:15, cold and clear, the first estate sale starting at 8 out in Briarwood. Dee was in the front passenger seat with a thermos in each hand and an expression of intense maternal readiness on her face. Already grinning. "Tell me everything," she said, before I'd closed the door. "And don't skip the part where Roman's face fell, because I want that in high definition." It was more of a controlled collapse. "I'll take a controlled collapse. A controlled collapse works for me." She handed me the thermos. Betty was in the back beside me with the small leather notebook she used to jot down interesting estate sale finds. Betty had been a librarian for 34 years and continued to organize information out of pure habit. Carla was on the other side, her hospital badge still clipped to her jacket from a night shift she'd come directly from. Margot was driving. Margot is always driving. It's how she maintains the illusion of being in charge of at least one thing. I told them about the will. I told them about the video. I didn't tell them about the pregnancies. That part was still mine, and I wasn't ready to hand it to anyone yet. But I told them about the 40%, the board seat, the 30 days I had to accept. "He left you 40% of a construction holding company?" Carla said slowly. "As in, you own more of it than Roman does." "Conditionally, yes." "Oh my God," she turned to Dee. "She owns more of the company than Roman." I heard, Dee pointed at me. "Are you taking it?" "I don't know yet. There are legal." "Of course you're taking it. What's the alternative? Step aside and wave him through? Again?" "There are complications I need to understand before." "There are always complications, and they always resolve in favor of whoever has the sharper attorney." She settled back in her seat with the conviction of someone who has made the correct assessment. "Also, for the record, that man spent 14 years of your life as a going concern, and your father-in-law just posthumously bombed him from orbit. And you're sitting here talking about complications like you're reviewing a drug interaction?" From the back, without looking up from her notebook, Betty said, quietly, with a pause, "Take the 40%, Nina." "Betty, that's all I have to say." We drove in silence for a moment. Comfortable, familiar silence. The kind that means no one needs to fill it. "What are we doing about Roman?" Carla asked. "Strategically speaking." "I'm meeting with Eleanor on Tuesday." "I mean, what are we doing about him?" She made a gesture that encompassed a range of options from legal action to something considerably less structured. "We are doing nothing about Roman. Eleanor is handling Roman." "We could show up at his apartment with signs," Dee offered. "We are absolutely not doing that." "Anonymous signs." "Dee, I'm generating options, that's all. I'm a brainstormer." Margot pulled into the estate sale parking area and we piled out into the cold morning air. The sale was in an old Victorian, the kind that smells like cedar and past decisions. And Bet found a complete set of Edith Wharton first editions for $12. And Dee found a set of ceramic owls that she claimed were ironically charming. and that no one believed she was buying ironically. And Carla found an industrial-era medical diagram in a cracked frame that she immediately photographed and texted to the entire hospital floor. I found the chairs in a back room. 4 dining chairs, set against a water-stained wall, painted over twice, white on top, then mustard yellow underneath from a mid-century renovation, someone's idea of updating. The profile of the legs, though, was distinctive, a turned spindle pattern with a specific taper that I recognized from a reference book I'd been consulting for 3 years. I squatted down and ran my thumb along one leg, feeling through the layers. I tilted my phone's light to the underside of the seat rail and made out a maker's mark, partially obscured. G.R.A. Elias Graves. County Craftworks, established 1882. If these were his, and that mark was his, they were worth considerably more than the $15 asking price on the card in front of them. I paid $60 for all 4 and loaded them into Margot's cargo area. On the drive back, I thought about layers, about what you find when you're willing to strip them away, carefully, one at a time, about how the thing underneath is always the truest version of what the thing is, and how you only know paint is covering something if you've learned to look at the profile instead of the surface. Arthur Hargrove had learned to look at my profile, 14 years late, but he'd looked. Eleanor filed my acceptance of the board seat on the 22nd day, which gave me 8 days to spare, and sent Roman's attorney a letter that was, according to Eleanor, scrupulously polite and impossible to challenge. I have come to believe this is the highest category of legal communication. The first time I walked into Hargrove Holdings, it was a Wednesday morning in late March. The building was 12 stories of granite and brushed steel in the business district. The lobby done in materials that projected stability without warmth. Arthur's aesthetic in every sense. There was a reception desk, a sitting area beyond it, and a glass-enclosed conference room visible from the lobby. Arthur's design, I learned later, because he believed visible accountability was the highest form of corporate culture. He was the kind of man who required himself to operate in view of others and expected the same from the people he employed. The fish tanks were Arthur's too. 2 of them, flanking the elevator bank, 7 feet tall apiece, built into the lobby wall, filled with koi the size of large house cats, moving in their slow, self-satisfied circuits. I stopped in front of one on my first morning and found myself looking at a fish the color of old tangerine that was regarding me with what I can only describe as professional detachment, the look of something that has been evaluated and found acceptable, not particularly exciting. Harold, the facilities manager, compact, serious, 11 years as Arthur's driver before taking over the building, saw me looking. Mr. Hargrove fed them every morning at 7:15, regular as a watch. What do they eat? Koi pellets mostly. He also gave them fruit occasionally. Harold paused with dignity. He talked to them sometimes, in the mornings before anyone else came in. I never mentioned it to anyone. I won't either, I said. I found the koi pellets in the supply closet beside the elevator. I fed them the next morning at 7:15. It seemed like the right thing to do. The executive suite was on the 10th floor. Dennis Croft, the CFO, met me at the elevator with a smile that had too many teeth in it and a handshake that lasted a beat too long. He was 52, soft-spoken, meticulously dressed in a way that said, "Please don't look too closely to anyone trained to read the signals." He gave me what he called an onboarding overview, quarterly reports, organizational charts, active construction contracts. I sat across from him at the conference table and listened and nodded and asked measured questions. I am a physician. I know how to make people comfortable enough to become careless. They stop performing once they believe you're satisfied. And the moment they stop performing is the moment you start seeing what's actually there. There was a rhythm to the numbers that was wrong. Not dramatically wrong. Nothing you'd catch on a first pass. Nothing that would survive a formal audit alarm. But wrong in the way a patient's resting pulse can be technically within normal range and still feel off under your fingers. I didn't understand it yet. I filed the feeling away the way I file clinical instincts when I don't yet have the data to explain them. On my way out, I passed Roman in the lobby. He was coming in with Bradley Vane, both of them mid-conversation, and he stopped when he saw me in the same way you stop when you've walked onto ice and need a moment to calculate whether it will hold. Coldly, flatly. Nina, Roman. He looked at my temporary badge, board director printed under my name, and looked at it for 2 full seconds before he looked away. This is going to be a disaster. For one of us, I agreed, and went past him to the exit. He came to my house on a Sunday. I was in the workshop when I heard the knock. The knock of someone who doesn't expect to be denied, which I recognized immediately as Roman's particular rhythm. I put down the cabinet scraper I'd been using on the Graves chairs. The top layer of white was coming off in long, satisfying curls, and went to the front door. He was in a wool coat, hands in his pockets, looking like he hadn't slept well in several days. This meant he'd probably slept fine, but wanted to appear otherwise. Roman had always understood the strategic value of looking worn. "Can I come in?" "No," I said. He looked briefly surprised. In 14 years, I had rarely delivered a flat number without softening it first. "Nina, this doesn't have to be a fight. We were married for 14 years. We can talk like adults. We're talking like adults now. You asked, I answered. That's adult communication." He pressed his lips together and tried a different tack. "What my father did, I understand it was unexpected, but you have to see that this situation is unworkable. You have no background in construction. I'm not building anything, Roman. I'm sitting on a board. And you'll be in a position making decisions that affect 340 employees. 287, I said. I counted the org chart." He stopped. "I'll buy you out," he said. "Fair market value for your share plus a 20% premium. You take the money, you step back, everything is clean. What does your father's note say?" The 3 sentences Eleanor read aloud. He didn't answer. "Roman, what does it say?" His jaw moved. "That note means nothing. He was unwell in his last months. His judgment was clear enough to register the Halcott Street deed 2 years ago," I said. Long before the diagnosis, I watched something tighten in his face. Not surprise, recognition. The look of someone realizing a specific door they'd thought was locked has been open the whole time. "You knew about the deed." "I knew about the property," he caught himself. "That property has been in the family for 60 years. It's mine," I said. "The deed is recorded. Eleanor confirmed it." I looked at him for a moment. "What did you tell your father about me, Roman? Over the years, what version of me did you give him?" The silence that followed was not the silence of someone who doesn't know the answer. It was the silence of someone choosing between answers, running the calculation of how much truth is survivable. He settled on, "I told him what I saw. You are always more focused on your own things, your work, your projects, your friends." He said "your friends" the way certain people say "your people," with a faint, practiced wistfulness that was supposed to read as grief, but landed as something uglier. My father wanted to be proud of the family I built. I couldn't give him that if the family wasn't— He stopped. If the family wasn't what? He looked past me at the workshop visible at the end of the hall, at the Graves chairs sitting under the work lights, half stripped, the yellow layer beginning to show through. He was disappointed in me, Roman said, finally, quietly. He'd been disappointed in me since I was in my mid-20s, and every time I tried to fix it— He stopped again. His voice had a rawness in it I hadn't expected and didn't quite know what to do with. It doesn't matter now. You made me into the reason, I said. He didn't deny it. He pulled one hand from his pocket, looked at it, put it back. The buyout offer is real. Think about it. I'll think about it, I said. Don't come back here. I closed the door. I stood in the hallway for a moment with my back against it, listening to his footsteps recede down the porch steps and across the walk. The workshop smelled of mineral spirits and old paint. The dining chairs sat half-stripped, the yellow showing through in ragged patches, the dark walnut beneath not yet visible. But I knew it was there. I'd felt it in the grain. I went back to work. Eleanor had Walt Garner's full investigative report in her files. Arthur had filed it with instructions to release it to me after the reading. It was 43 pages. I read it at my kitchen table on a Monday night with the back door propped open because April had arrived a week early with genuinely warm air, and I was halfway through the second section when I heard the characteristic sound of the back door swinging wider on its hinge, and the equally characteristic sound of something large, placid, and entirely without embarrassment settling itself on my kitchen floor. I looked up. Gerald had let himself in. Gerald is a capybara. He belongs to Dee, in the philosophical sense that Dee purchased him at an exotic animal rescue auction 3 years ago and provides his food and shelter, though Gerald himself doesn't appear to recognize any particular authority in this arrangement. He weighs approximately 120 pounds, is the color of warm toast, and has the expression of a creature who has heard every possible piece of human news and found it insufficient grounds for concern. He navigated Dee's fence with increasing creativity as the fence aged, and he'd taken to visiting my house with a frequency that suggested either a genuine preference or the knowledge that I kept good produce. Dee's position was that Gerald was community property and that I was being provincial about the idea of borders. I had stopped arguing. Gerald settled himself near the refrigerator and regarded me with mild approval. "You have excellent timing," I said. He blinked. A single, deliberate blink. I turned back to the report. The first section was, as Arthur had described, a record of my habits. The St. Agatha's visits, attendance logs reproduced, a receipt for Mrs. Kowalski's surgical copay, somehow obtained. Walt Garner was a thorough man. Notes about the workshop, the Saturday estate sales, the friends. Reading it had the disorienting quality of reading a detailed medical chart with your own name on it. Someone had been watching me live my life, quietly and without my knowledge, for the better part of a year. The second section was different. It contained transcripts, not recordings, but Garner's notes from conversations with Arthur's household staff, his longtime business associates, his cousin who'd kept in sporadic contact. Cross-references, a timeline. The first entry in the timeline that stopped me. Roman had told Arthur, shortly after our second pregnancy loss, that I had decided I didn't want children after all, that I had told Roman I wasn't interested in trying again, that I was too focused on my career. I read that sentence 3 times. The second entry, when I'd sent Arthur a birthday card in 2019, a real card, handwritten,
because I'd been trying harder that year and it seemed like a small, low-risk gesture. The card had never reached him. Garner's notes indicated that mail to Arthur's home office had been routed through Roman's assistant during an 8-month period of office renovation. There was a documented gap in Arthur's received correspondence from me corresponding exactly to that period. The third entry. In the year before the divorce, I had called Arthur's direct line 4 times. The calls had been logged as declined. Arthur's personal assistant, according to her interview with Garner, had never once declined a call from me on Arthur's behalf. She had never seen these calls come in at all.
My hands were flat on the table. The report was open to page 27. The kitchen was quiet except for Gerald's slow, measured breathing from his spot by the refrigerator. I sat with the information the way you sit with a new diagnosis, not immediately reacting, not interpreting, just letting the reality of it exist in the room with you. 14 years. Roman had managed his father's perception of me the way a stage director controls what an audience sees, not through dramatic deception, but through sustained control of access, by being the only story Arthur heard, by intercepting the small gestures, the card, the calls, that might have started a conversation and ended the story Roman was telling. Arthur Hargrove was not a trusting man. He had built an empire on his own wariness about other people's motives, and he had trusted his son's version of his son's wife, until, 3 years ago, he'd hired Walt Garner and started looking for himself. What had he found? Not the cold, career-obsessed woman who'd written off the family. He'd found Sunday afternoons in nursing homes. 3 losses survived in near silence. A surgical copay filed under my own name with no announcement. He'd found me. 3 years before he died, he'd finally found me. And by then, the divorce was already in motion, and the diagnosis was coming. And all he could do was file a deed and rewrite a will and record himself speaking to a camera, trying to say in 4 minutes what 14 years of managed silence had prevented. My vision had blurred without my noticing. I pressed my wrist to my eyes. Gerald shifted with great dignity and settled his warm, heavy side against my feet, quietly to the room. "Thank you," I said. He didn't respond. He was a capybara. He had limits. I turned to page 28, and I kept reading. It took me 3 weeks on the board to understand what was wrong with Hargrove Holdings' finances. It took me 1 more day to confirm it. Dennis Croft had been siphoning project funds through a series of shell subcontractors since 2018. It was elegant in a certain sense, the way a well-disguised fracture can be elegant on an X-ray, the geometry of it almost admirable before you remember what it means. Hargrove Holdings would contract with a company called, for example, Meridian Site Services LLC for drainage work on a commercial project. Meridian would file invoices, Hargrove would pay. But Meridian and its 3 associated entities, Apex Earthwork, Premier Ground Solutions, and Coastal Grading Associates, all had the same registered agent, the same Delaware P.O. box, and no verifiable employees or physical locations at their stated addresses. I had Margot run the addresses through her commercial property database. She called me back in 12 minutes. The registered address for Apex Earthwork is a UPS store on a strip mall in Wilmington, Delaware. Yes. Nina, how much money are we talking about? Between 2018 and present, conservative estimate, somewhere between $2.5 and $3 million. Silence on the line. And Roman? Croft's wife has been on Roman's personal payroll since 2019, listed as a consulting fee in Roman's personal expense account, which runs through the company's executive allowances. I was in Arthur's old chair at the 10th floor conference table, looking at the koi tank's faint blue glow visible from the corridor window. Roman wasn't running the scheme, but he knew it was running, and he said nothing. "He let you walk into that company," Margot said. "He wanted you in there. If the fraud surfaced on my watch, I'd be the new board member who either brought it with her or failed to catch it in time. Either story works against me." The silence on the line stretched. "Oh, that son of a bitch." "Language? I'm a real estate agent, Nina. I'm professionally entitled to opinions about fraud." I waited until I had everything I needed. Then I called Roman, not from my personal phone, from Eleanor's office, on record, with Eleanor present, on a Tuesday morning when the light through the conference windows was flat and gray and businesslike, and the city outside was going about its ordinary life with no knowledge of what was happening on the 14th floor. He picked up on the third ring, carefully, with an undertone of annoyance. "What do you want, Nina?" "I want to tell you what I found." I told him about Meridian Site Services, about Apex Earthwork, Premier Ground Solutions, Coastal Grading Associates, about the invoices and the Delaware UPS store and Croft's wife and the consulting fees. I gave him the total figure. He was quiet for 11 seconds. I counted, with the first real threat in it. "Where are you getting this?" "I'm a physician, Roman. I read charts. Your company's financial statements are a chart. They tell me the same thing patient charts always tell me. When something doesn't fit the pattern, something is wrong." "This is speculation. You don't have standing to—" "Eleanor is filing with the state comptroller's office tomorrow morning. Walt Garner is submitting a supplemental investigative report to the same office. The documentation is complete." A pause. "Your father kept very good records. Did you know that? He kept records of everything, including logs of your conversations with Dennis Croft from 2017 onward, including a call in March 2018 in which you told Croft you would handle Arthur's concerns about the Q4 variance reports." Another silence. "You can't—" "Eleanor has confirmed it. All of it is in the filing." I looked at the window. "I also know about the mail routing, the phone calls you had redirected, what you told your father about the pregnancies." The silence this time was different, longer. The particular silence of someone who has believed for a long time that a specific door was securely closed and has just understood that it was never locked at all. "Nina, I'm not interested in your explanation. I want you to understand what is going to happen. The state investigation will proceed. Your 30% share will be placed in legal hold pending the outcome. Your role at the company is over. Bradley Vane is a skilled attorney, and he won't be able to save all of it." I paused. "I want you to understand one more thing." "What?" And this was the part I'd been carrying for weeks. "I tried to call your father 4 times in the last year of our marriage. 4 times. He didn't know the calls came in. He thought I'd given up on him." The old pain of it was sharp and specific, sharper than I'd expected. I breathed through it. "He died thinking I hadn't tried, because you made sure of it. That's the part I don't forgive." I ended the call. Eleanor looked at me across her desk. She let a moment pass. "The filing is actually ready for Wednesday," she said. "Not tomorrow. I apologize for the slight inaccuracy." "That's all right." I needed him to sit with it for 24 more hours. Eleanor allowed herself the smallest possible expression of professional approval, which on her face was considerable. Bradley Vane sent the formal buyout offer on a Thursday, express courier, with a cover letter that was pleasantly worded and a number that was considerably more than Roman's previous verbal offer. It was enough to be interesting, not insulting, not obviously low. The number of someone who had done their homework and was making a genuine play. I sat with it for 2 days. I won't pretend I didn't think about it seriously. Taking the money would mean leaving the company to its legal proceedings, going back to medicine full-time, going back to the workshop on weekends. The fraud would come out regardless. Eleanor had made sure of that. I didn't need to be present for the consequences. I could take the money and let the dominoes fall without me in the room. On Friday morning, I fed the koi at 7:15 and stood in front of the tank for a moment. The big orange one came to the glass and held there, watching me with his improbable calm. Arthur had talked to them, Harold had said. In the mornings, before anyone else came in the quiet lobby. I wondered what Arthur had talked about, what a man who had spent 60 years building something tells the fish in the lobby when no one else is there to hear. I thought about him sitting in that chair, getting the words right, knowing he was running out of time to say what he hadn't said in 14 years. I thought about the annex on Halcott Street, which I'd visited once since the reading, picking my way through the dust and disuse, through rooms that smelled of old wood and closed decades. And where I'd found, on the narrow window ledge of what must have been a study, a pair of tortoiseshell reading glasses with the left arm slightly bent. I'd picked them up and turned them over in my hands. The prescription was strong. He'd needed them badly, and he'd left them deliberately, the way you leave something you want someone to find and keep. I called Eleanor. Tell Vane the answer is no. I'll word it appropriately. Word it however you like. The answer is no. The full board meeting was on a Thursday. 9 directors, plus me, plus Eleanor, attending as legal counsel. The state comptroller's office had been notified the previous Wednesday. Dennis Croft had been placed on administrative leave the Friday before, after a meeting with the 3 outside board members who had, once presented with the documentation, been appallingly unsurprised. They had had concerns for 2 years. They had brought those concerns to Roman. Roman had told them the numbers were under internal review. I worked in the workshop until 2 a.m. on Wednesday night. The Graves chairs were nearly finished. 1 coat of lye solution had lifted the last of the paint, and the walnut beneath had come through the grain the way good old wood always does, richer and more complex than anything manufactured today. I'd confirmed the maker's mark fully. Graves, County Craftworks, established 1882. They were worth $1,200 apiece. I had paid $60 for all 4. I sat on my workshop stool with the coffee I'd made at midnight, Arthur's reading glasses on the bench beside me. I'd brought them from the annex. I turned them over periodically, feeling the slightly crooked left arm. A simple repair, 10 minutes with the right pliers. But Arthur had worn them as they were for years, because adjusting eyeglasses requires asking someone for help, and Arthur was not a man who asked for help with small things. In 14 years, I could have offered. I hadn't known the offer would have been accepted. The workshop smelled of mineral spirits and lye and old walnut. The coffee was cooling. I thought about the board meeting in 7 hours, and about Arthur, and about 14 years of Sunday dinners where I'd cleared dishes with a 63-year-old housekeeper and driven home in silence while Roman said he'd come around. I thought about what Dee had said 3 weeks ago at the estate sale, when I'd told her I wasn't sure I was the right person for this. She'd been holding a ceramic owl with a slightly crazed glaze, and she'd looked at me across a dusty parlor full of other people's discarded things. Seriously, without her usual armor of humor. Nina, you've been diagnosing complicated systems for 15 years. Roman is not a complicated system. He's a man who thought nobody would look too closely because nobody ever had. You look closely at everything. That's your actual thing. She'd set the owl down, then picked it up again. Also, you bought 4 valuable chairs for $60. You already won. I finished the coffee cold, turned off the workshop lights, went inside. For the first time in several weeks, I slept without waking at 3 a.m. with my mind running. The conference room on the 12th floor was glass-walled, visible from the elevator bank and from the corridor. Arthur's design. I arrived at 8:15. Harold was at the elevator with the koi pellets, as he had been every morning I'd come in. Evenly, with quiet gravity. Good luck today, Dr. Mercer. Thank you, Harold. I fed the koi. The big orange one took the pellets with the air of someone doing me a small favor. I put the bag back in the supply closet and went upstairs. The 9 directors were seated when I came in. Eleanor was at the far end with her files. Roman was absent. He'd been advised in writing that his share was in legal hold, and he had no standing at this meeting, and Bradley Vane had sent a letter of protest that Eleanor had filed with a response amounting to a very long, precise way of saying no. Dennis Croft's chair was empty. I sat at the head of the table, Arthur's seat. Nobody objected, which told me something about where the room already stood. I presented the documentation in order, not dramatically. I have never trusted drama. I presented it the way I present findings at a case review, methodically, with primary sources, with the reasoning made explicit at every step. The shell companies, the invoices, the Delaware registrations, the consulting fees, Roman's 2018 phone call, the timeline of events from the first diverted invoice to the present. Halfway through, Patricia Holst, outside director, 9 years on the board, iron nerves, excellent posture, put down her pen. With deliberate calm. We knew something was wrong, she said. We flagged it. We were told it was under review. I know. How long has this been active? Based on the first invoice date, just over 5 years. She exchanged a look with the director beside her. Not surprise, but the grim relief of people who've been ignored and are finally being heard. Something that was waiting to be said, finally said. I continued. When I finished, the room was quiet. I move that we authorize submission of the complete documentation package to the State Comptroller's Office and retain independent legal counsel for the company's cooperation with any subsequent investigation, Patricia Holst said. Seconded, said 3 voices, very nearly simultaneously. The vote was 9-0. I looked at the empty chair at the head of the table, at my chair, and I thought of Arthur Hargrove in the mornings, feeding his fish, talking to them in the quiet lobby before the day began. Watching the company he'd built with his own hands and his own wariness, and watching it be quietly hollowed out by the son he'd loved and the man that son had chosen to protect. He'd found me 3 years too late for the marriage, but not too late for this. The annex on Howcott Street will be renovated beginning next month, I said. Mr. Hargrove left it to me for a reason. I intend to use it well. Roman contested the will. Of course he did. His attorneys filed on the grounds of diminished capacity. Arthur's deteriorating health in his final months, they argued, had compromised his judgment, and the bequest to me represented a departure from his established intentions. The filing included a declaration from Roman characterizing my relationship with Arthur as estranged and minimal, and asserting that Arthur's late-stage decisions had been influenced by incomplete information provided by a private investigator with limited context. Eleanor replied with a sealed envelope that Arthur had left specifically for this contingency. She had known about it since the reading and had, in her professionally neutral way, been quietly ready for this moment. The letter was 4 pages, notarized by 2 witnesses, written in Arthur's precise, measured handwriting with no corrections. It described in sequence what Roman had told him about me over the years, what Walt Garner's report had found, Arthur's own conclusions about the gap between those 2 accounts, the specific documented instances of intercepted communication that Garner had identified, and Arthur's assessment of his own culpability for accepting his son's version of events for as long as he had. The letter also contained a single sentence that Eleanor read aloud in the opposing attorney's conference room, with Roman and Bradley Vane present. If my son contests this will, this letter will be entered into the public record in its entirety, at which point the question of his fitness to inherit anything at all will be a matter of open discussion. Roman sat across from his attorneys with both hands flat on the table, looking at the letter. His face was very still. The practiced composure was intact, but the thing behind it, the thing that had always been behind it, doing the real work, was not. Vicky Strand had not come with him. She'd stopped appearing, as far as I could tell, approximately 2 weeks after the board meeting. There was something almost poignant about that. She'd walked into something she hadn't been told about, had found herself in the wreckage of a plan she hadn't made, had made the quiet calculation that most people eventually make when they realize they've been handed someone else's map. I allowed myself to notice this without either satisfaction or excessive sympathy. She'd made her choices, and now she was making different ones. The will contest was withdrawn the following Monday. 7 months later, the annex on Halcott Street was, if not finished, then alive. The Raccoon family that had taken up residence in the East Wing, 6 of them, a whole generational household, had been relocated by a wildlife management team to a preserve 20 miles outside the city. I had felt the appropriate guilt about this and donated to the preserve's operating fund, which the preserve's director had received with the restrained gratitude of someone who is professionally accustomed to people feeling guilty about raccoons. The stucco work on the parlor ceiling had emerged, after 6 weeks of careful, layered stripping, into something that stopped the conservation specialist from the university in the doorway for a full 20 minutes, with genuine awe barely contained. "Do you understand what this is?" she'd said finally. "Botanical motifs. I think 1880s, possibly earlier," I said. "Can you date it more precisely?" 1880s, possibly late 1870s. She looked at me. "This is a significant find." "It's a significant ceiling," I said. The outbuilding at the back of the property, originally a carriage house, then a storage space, then nothing in particular, had been converted into a working restoration studio with proper lighting and ventilation and a small teaching alcove. I had 3 apprentices, 2 graduate students from the university's conservation program, and Betty, who had decided at 62 that retirement was insufficient occupation and that she had, in fact, always wanted to know how furniture was made. Hargrove Holdings had restructured under a new CFO and, with the company's full cooperation with the state's investigation, was stabilizing. Roman's 30% share was in ongoing legal proceedings. His attorneys had filed 3 motions in 7 months and lost 2 of them. Dennis Croft had resigned ahead of the formal charges and was cooperating with investigators in the way that people cooperate when the alternative is considerably worse. I was still on the board. I went in on Mondays and Thursdays. I fed the koi at 7:15. The big orange one had begun to come to the glass when he heard me approach, which Harold observed was unprecedented in his 11 years of watching these fish. I did not attribute significance to this beyond the obvious fact that fish can be conditioned to associate specific humans with food. I thought about Arthur anyway. On a Saturday in October, Dee came by with Gerald on his new lead. He'd finally been fitted with a proper harness, which did nothing to alter his fundamental position on personal sovereignty. And we sat in the restored parlor under the exposed stucco and drank coffee and looked at what was coming through the ceiling. "You know," Dee said, "I've been trying to figure out the right word for all of this, for what happened." "You mean the company?" "I mean all of it. The whole Roman and the years and Arthur and all of it." She turned her coffee cup in her hands. "I think the word is restoration." I looked up at the ceiling, at the botanical motifs that had been there for nearly 140 years, patient in the dark, under their layers of paint and lime wash, waiting for someone with the time and the willingness to look. "It's a good word," I said. Gerald had settled between us on the dusty floor, enormous and tranquil, regarding the ceiling with an expression that communicated, if anything, complete acceptance of whatever situation he found himself in. Which is, I have come to believe, about the best any of us can manage on most days. Arthur's reading glasses were in my jacket pocket. I carried them with me most days, not as a talisman exactly, more as a reminder that the thing you're looking at and the thing that's actually there are not always the same. That layers accumulate of paint, of silence, of stories told by people who control the telling. That you have to be willing to strip them away carefully, one at a time, without destroying what's underneath. That it's never too late to look more closely. That same month, I had the glasses repaired, the left arm straightened at last, 10 minutes in the hands of an optician who was cheerful about the vintage frames and asked where I'd found them. I told him they'd belonged to a family member. He handed them back, both arms now perfectly level. I put them on before I drove home just to see. Arthur's prescription was too strong for me. The world through his lenses was slightly blurred at the edges, everything at a distance soft and unresolvable. But everything close was extraordinarily clear. That seemed, I thought, about right.